speak out or maybe give us a suggestion, then maybe the moderator may want a feedback from the attendees, the participants. So if at all that's the case, let me know. At least I can give them the rights, because only the panelists can be able to raise their hands and speak. So thank you. I think you can now just start.
Vincent, are we ready to begin?
Yes, go on.
Well, thank you for everyone for joining us on our workshop today at the Internet Governance Forum on the role of ICT in achieving sustainable development goals and existing data gaps for measuring progress. My name is Christopher Yu of the University of Pennsylvania. I will be serving as the moderator here and for this distinguished panel. At the University of Pennsylvania, I lead an initiative called One World Connected, which is has the goal of collecting as much data as possible on innovative ways to bring more people online, and to try to build a data central point of data is collected in a way that allows comparisons across projects, so we can learn from what has been done in the past to improve what we've done in the future. Obviously, our interest in learning from what is going on is the inspiration for this panel, and we are pleased and delighted to have three experts who are acutely aware of the wonderful things we can do with data in terms of closing the digital divide, but also are very well aware of the limits of the current data and what more needs to be done. And we are very grateful to have them here to share their expertise with us today. Just in no particular order, start with an alphabetical order. Our speakers are Anne Delaporte, Insights Manager for the Connected Women Program for GSMA. Antonio Garcia Zavallos is the Lead Specialist for Technology for the Inter-American Development Bank. And Lorraine Porciuncula, my apologies, who is Director of the Data and Jurisdiction Program at Internet and Jurisdiction. And as just for those of you who know her, Lorraine, you may have known her. She recently left the position as an economist and policy analyst on communications, infrastructure, and services at the Digital Economy and Policy Division of the OECD. So we have three very distinguished experts who are working with data, trying to understand and make recommendations and investments and guiding how we're actually making positive action to close the digital divide. So we would like to start with, we will do about 60 minutes of questions with the panelists and then open the floor to question and answer at the end. So let me just, well, in the order I introduced you, let's just start that way. Anne, let's just start with a basic question. Why is data so important? I mean, why does everyone always talk about this as a key need to build closing the digital divide? You're still on mute, Anne.
Okay, now it's working. I'd say like data is important like for like I would say three things. First, like to measure success and impact to achieve the sustainable development goals. I mean that's what we're here for. But also like to inform decisions, because without data you can't set objectives, you can't take any decision. And I think that's what we're like as a GSMA trying to do is helping our operators to track data, monitor data to then be able to make the right decision, and as well as policymakers. And the third one is to reduce inequalities. So using data to improve the the life of people. I mean, working in the mobile industry, it's using data to close the digital divide, to close to reduce inequalities in gender. So yeah, to me, that's the three reasons why we need data.
You're on mute, Christoph.
I made the same, follow the same pattern from Anne. I learned from the best. So Antonio, how about you? You're interested in data. Why is it that it is important for the decision-making in your work at the IADB?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Christopher, and thank you very much for the opportunity of being here with you all. You know, whenever that we are designing, as Anne was mentioning before, whenever that we are designing a public policy and a specific intervention in a particular country, we have to understand what is the market failure. And it's very difficult to understand what is the market failure or the type of interventions that we need to do unless we have a clear understanding of what is the status quo and what are the main challenges that the country is facing. So having access to that data, to that information, will not only provide us with very useful information that allow us to understand what is the status quo and what is the starting point, but also which should be the specific policies and regulation that we need to define, either in terms of regulation, either in terms of increasing the level playing field competition, or moreover, even to identify which is the infrastructure gap and what could be the potential financing or the potential policy reforms that are needed in that particular country or region in order for them to catch up with the rest of the countries or the rest of the regions around the world.
So I find both of your answers fascinating in one sense. It's figuring out what to do, but also to measure it. I know that you have to scope the actual intervention, but I know from my previous work with you, Antonio, a major issue is after the intervention in one country, you'll often be discussing with other countries to show what you've learned from the previous efforts, to show how we can benefit and leverage that benefits into the future. And that is a critical role that plays. And that's, again, what Anne said, the first thing she said, we need to learn how to measure success and not just target interventions, but to figure out how we can do things and do things better. Lorraine.
Hi, Chris. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here among this panel of friends and experts. So why data is important? As humans, we like using analogies, right? So one could be data is the new sunshine or the new air. For me, because of my background in infrastructure regulation, I like saying that data is an underlying infrastructure for so many things. But mostly it is a key asset everywhere for social and economic development. For business, it's about value creation to improve business decisions, new services, products, and entirely new business models. For governments is to inform policy making. In academia is to produce knowledge. Data is different than knowledge in itself, right? And for civil society, data is important for empowerment, either individual or collective. So in a nutshell, data is very important.
So I think you've all made a powerful case about why it's critical. When you come to meetings, you constantly hear, though, we need more data. There's not enough data. So let's go back the other way, Lorraine, starting with you, having set this up so wonderfully. If it's so important and you all agree to this, why is it so hard to get, and why do we have so not enough?
I think, so starting from a more granular perspective, there's a lack of standardization of several indicators. And in my previous role as an economist in the OECD, I would see that, especially in countries that were not part of the OECD membership, the difficulty of actually comparing different data sets. And so and we end up using very generic indicators to compare countries, such as internet users or internet usages, usage in that case. But then the experience of the internet is much more granular than just if someone is using the internet or not. And a lot of the data that we have is just very basic in terms of being online or offline. And as Antonio was saying, a lot of the market failures, I mean, you need more information to understand what are the bottlenecks there for access and usage of technology. But then beyond the issue of standards, and I think one of the reasons of those issues is the lack of the required institutional framework in terms of the mandate that regulators may have to collect certain kind of data, the clear plan and action to use that data and what for, and an institutional framework to actually have a plan to do informed and evidence-based policymaking. In terms of traditional providers, especially when you're talking about internet and ICTs, I think the issue of the mandate is resolved in many developed countries, especially. But for example, when we're going in terms of trying to understand what is the issue of internet usage and the data that internet companies may have and OTTs, that's not really the case. There isn't the mandate of regulators and policymakers to collect that kind of data. And on another level, beyond the issue of standards and the issue of institutional framework, there's also the lack of capacity and human capacity, both from the technical side of dealing with this data and also in terms of the policy side, because you actually need policy people to be able to bridge these two worlds in terms of understanding what kind of information and data and knowledge is needed to inform policy. And finally, in the last dimension, there's lack of cooperation between stakeholders. And we are in the IGF in a multi-stakeholder forum. So it's always important to talk about that in terms of the cooperation between international and regional organizations and governments and service providers, civil society and academia, for you actually to be able to bridge those issues in terms of standards, institutions, capacity, etc. So that's a first thought on that.
Antonio, your thoughts, please.
Yeah, thank you, Christopher. I totally agree with Lorraine. I would say that this is probably a mix of capabilities and incentives. Let me just explain and elaborate a little bit more on this. When it's about the institutional level, one of the things that we have observed is that, for instance, regulators, even though sometimes they do have the mandate, they are lacking the capabilities to collect and gather those data. Moreover, they are lacking capabilities to even analyze that data. So let's say that there is one specific problem associated to the capabilities and the institutionality framework that somehow endorse the mandate of all those regulators and institutions to request that information and eventually analyze and provide some conclusions out of that. So from that end, we have identified two major concerns. The first one, as Lorraine was mentioning, is precisely the institutional framework, how to make the institutions really capable of requesting that information and having the strong mandate to, at some moment in time, even introduce some sort of fines or penalizations on the industry as a whole whenever that they are not fulfilling with that mandate. And on the other side, we have another issue that is related to the mandate and the capabilities to analyze and take advantage of that information to the design and implementation of particular policies. So from that end, there is quite a lot of, let's say, areas of actions that we may consider. But also there is a mix, and I was mentioning before, associated to incentives. Sometimes it happens that the private sector as such, they are very comfortable in the area in which they are providing businesses, and for them to provide, let's say, data and information on particular areas of the business is not right. I mean, they understand that they don't get anything out of that beyond more regulation, beyond more implementation of particular actions that are going against the P&L and so on and so forth. So probably here, there is a lack of incentives in the sense that probably there is a missing link between the national strategies and that the government as a whole are having and the objectives that the private sector do have in order for them to precisely establish this sort of a matching between what the government wants to do and what the private sector may get out of that particular strategy. So there is also an issue related to incentives that we have observed that makes the gathering of that information a little bit complicated.
Anne.
I echo what Lorraine and Antonio have said. I think on that I would add also the idea that we talk about data, more data, but I think it's also like the fact of like what it's not about only collecting data, it's collecting the right data for achieving the right purpose. And often we collect too many data, and it comes back to capabilities as well of like as private sector, government, etc., having the capability to actually understand which indicators are important, what data I will need to measure progress, to track whatever indicator we want. And a lot of time it's also like a very top-down approach where it's more like, I would say, institutional organizations who want data, but local government don't necessarily see the value of it, and getting back to them, like make them understand why it's needed. And often I've seen that and coming and saying, I need this data, and local government don't have the capacity, don't understand why they need to do it, and don't see the value of it. And the same way, like with the private sector, I've been working a lot on like understanding the gender gap in mobile internet, mobile use in general. And it's really like working with operators to make them understand the value of it from a commercial perspective, from a social perspective. So really bringing back like, why do I need to collect the data? Something I would add to the rest that has been said so far of why it's difficult to produce data and produce quality data.
So what's also fascinating to me in the work we're doing, the way international organizations are often constructed, they often can gather a great deal of data, but they can't analyze it in a very hard-nosed way. They can't pick winners and losers, if you will, and identify successes and failures as easily. You often see examples as opposed to systematic analysis because they have constituencies and members who have sensitivities who don't want to be told, no one wants to be said, it's better than this, this is better than that. And we found that many of the international organizations we worked with actually were delighted to have someone with some distance from that to be able to make those kinds of analyses and claims. So this has been great in principle. I want to ask you both, all three of you, a question, which is, we've seen the problem, we've set the stage of the need, we have the problems. Can you think of examples where that were particularly good examples of when you got the data you needed? Is there an innovative way? Are there ways to solve this problem that you've seen that obviously we have the reporting by governments, we ask companies for data, mandatory reporting to regulators, but can you help us with thinking through solutions, not just the problem stories, but possibly some success stories or some positive stories about when we've actually asked for more data or tried to get more data and succeeded?
Well, let me just, if I may, Anne and Lorraine, let me give you a real example that is happening these days. At this moment in time, we are precisely having conversations with the government of Jamaica, and they are very keen on improving the level of digitalization that the country is facing. So in response to your question, I would say that there's, like a kind of a systematic methodology that in order for it to really be successful, we need to align the interests of the public and the private sector. So first point that I want to stress in here is that if we don't have a clear strategy, a clear idea of where we go as a country, it's going to be very difficult to convince the private operators, for instance, if we are talking about the telecom sector, to provide you with that data, So the first thing is that we need to have that strategy where we are and what are the targets that we want to achieve. The second thing is that we have to understand as well the market dynamics, in the sense that nowadays, and we are observing, the level of average return per users of the private sector is going down. The level of requirements in terms of investment for new technologies, but even investment for operation and maintenance remains pretty high. So it implies also that the telecom operators are facing some additional difficulties. And there is a public role that we have to understand. So in this particular situation of Jamaica, what we have done is come up with a strategy that is defining layers of data. First, by identifying which is the existing infrastructure, not only telecom, but also infrastructure coming from some other utilities. Second, identify the location of the different institutions, schools, hospitals, police stations, public services that nowadays, taking into account the situations that we are facing because of the COVID, is very important first to understand where are they located, and second, how far they are from those particular infrastructure, in such a way that even in situations of emergency or in situations in which we need to provide particular services or connectivity, we can identify which is the most cost-efficient way in which we can provide those services. So that would be like the second layer. And the third layer, it would be very much related to what are the technical specifications and what are the requirements in terms of technology that those particular locations are going to request. So in order for us to do that, there is a piece of information that we need to collect from the government, but there is a piece of information which is critical and only telecom operators and other utility companies can provide. Only by doing that, we will be able to come up with a sound program that is identifying the infrastructure gap and the policies that could be put in place in order for those public locations to be connected and overcome pandemic situations like the one that we are facing.
Fascinating. Anne, please.
So to add to what Antonio is saying, I think like you asked for example of where data were collected and it worked. And I think like, what we're doing in terms of infrastructure, we've developed coverage maps. So understanding, having really granular data that will help operators roll out cost-effective networks in rural areas. So, and in order to do that, it's really getting, in each country, getting operators to give us their data so that we can do these coverage maps, and that will requires as well the support of other stakeholders, in particular regulators and governments, ministries of ICT, etc., to get to that. And I think like over the years, we started with 2 countries with these coverage gaps, 8 last year, and now we have I think 15 countries covered that have been mapped in Africa, and it's still ongoing. So, and this really helps like not only to it's kind of like this circle where we need coverage data to be able to understand where we need to get more coverage, and that is also like helping get us better data, because obviously of all the ICT way of like collecting using ICT to serve surveys. So that is kind of like you need to know where you will what is covered, what is not covered, and then like able to collect your data. So anyway, so basically to say that it's useful not only for our operators to know where to cover, but also like the NGOs and government to basically better target their activities, and that's I think has been a very good example of like a good collaboration across like different stakeholders to get to that level.
Lorraine, do you have any thoughts?
I like that we are among peers here talking about telecom, so it's just easy to bridge the different discussions. I'm gonna echo what Antonio and eloquently put. I think that the issue of I like the point that Antonio made about incentives, and I think I would add to that a dimension of trust. I think it's very important, in addition to this alignment of objectives, is to foster trust between these different actors and in a framework for cooperation. And you asked you asked for examples, and I can think about country views that I worked on, which was Mexico and Brazil. And a while ago, operators in Mexico would give the data that they had on a printed sheet on a font 8 for the operator, and they would have to type in the computer. And I'm not talking that this happened 10 years ago, it happened 6 years ago. So I mean, it's very recent, this change, and it took a constitutional reform in Mexico to change the institutional framework there and to give more power to the regulator, so it wouldn't be questioned in the courts every single time that it decided to collect more data or to implement its decisions. But it also took this building of trust between stakeholders, and I think it's important to have this alignment, especially so the private sector knows what the data is being used for, and that it's being used in a responsible way, and that the decisions can be accounted for. So I mean, in the example of Brazil, for example, small ISPs are regulated by a different sort of service framework. What happens is that the regulator didn't, until very recently, and it's just finishing compiling this basic coverage map on internet connectivity in the country, because they weren't the traditional telco operators. So that meant that there was a lot of patches in the map that they had of connectivity, and ultimately that had negative effects for ISPs, and I'm going to explain why. The regulator was promoting remedies for market failures in specific regions where in their view there was no internet connectivity. So what happened is that those particular regions and municipalities were actually receiving sort of subsidies so that big telcos could come and invest in their networks in those places that already had pretty decent, good coverage, but from small ISPs that where the regulator didn't have any data from. So actually, by not providing data, they were actually having to compete with big players that were receiving subsidies from the government that thought that there was no service there. So I mean, now that you're actually building these connections and this trust and this understanding that that's what we need the data for, and if we actually know that you're there and you're providing the service, you're not going to be placed among the regions of Brazil where we don't have any connectivity. So I mean, it takes I think awareness and the building of trust and identifying the players and identifying what the policy objectives are there. So I just wanted to add this dimension to the discussion on telecoms, which is, yes, creating the incentives, creating the institutional framework, but making sure that this is done in a way to foster trust among players.
So you're talking about how to foster trust among these small ISPs and explain to them why it's important that they support providing data. Is that correct, right? So that's an interesting idea. And especially these smaller deployments, they've got a lot of work to do. And the idea of providing data to the government is not, they have to see the clear cost benefit analysis to make that go, is what I take you're saying. If they understand that, that makes it work better. What about the larger telcos, the larger providers, the incumbents? Antonio, Lorraine, and you've all talked about aligning incentives. Let's get down to it. How do you align the incentives for an incumbent? Because I know, even when, let's say, a service provider is trying to do some experiment of supporting innovative ways to connect more people, whether it's through zero rating or something else, they're providing the support. They can't get information out of the actual partner provider that they can get, that they're using. How do you overcome the reluctance, the understandable reluctance of private companies, larger providers to engage in this? Because as Antonio said, they have to look at, their responsibility is to look at the request for information and say, how will this help my organization? And that's the most profound incentive alignment problem we have for that group of people. Can you give me an example of how people have overcome those kinds of barriers?
Well, I would take the lead in here. You know, I think that what Lorraine was mentioning, it makes a lot of sense to me, in the sense that incentives at the end of the day comes out of a situation where you are going to win something. Let's put it in a very simple way. So telecom operators, the way in which any other private company is working, they decide to deploy and attend and provide particular areas whenever that they are going to get a particular return. So it is not about social return. In the case of the private sector, it's about financial return in most of the cases. So the incentives in there is that, again, whenever that you are designing a strategy associated to, for instance, allocating particular subsidies, it's very important that the way in which you decide and you design that particular auction, for instance, to provide services in those particular locations, you focus on giving precisely those subsidies in those areas that at this moment in time, let's say the financial return is clearly negative. So unless that is not happening, the operators will not be interested in going. And we do have some experiences in situations where, you know, either the telecom regulators are defining bidding processes associated to the allocation of frequency bands that eventually remain, not attended by the private sector because of the conditions that they are putting, or even we have situations when they are launching particular auctions to allocate those subsidies that, again, the way in which they were designed is not precisely aligned with what the expectation of the private sector are. So that's why I said at the very beginning that it's very important to understand the status quo and what is exactly what you want to achieve. And in doing that, you will be able to design those bidding processes and auctions in such a way that you take advantage of that. This is when it's about subsidies, but even if it's about creating a special purpose vehicle with a participation of a public and the private sector, the same thing is going to happen. You have to create, let's say, this neutral telecom operator that is going to be formed with contributions from the public, contributions from the private, and the governance model and the incentives that you are going to give to each of the stakeholders has to be aligned with those objectives that they do have in terms of a financial and economic return, especially taking into account, and I want to insist very much, the situation, the financial situations that the private sectors are, the private telecom operators are facing these days.
So Anne, if I can draw you in, you've made, GSMA's made coverage maps. I imagine you encounter a similar problem. You know, how do you convince people to contribute this information to the coverage maps? And are there unique challenges? How do you align those incentives so that you get people to cooperate?
That's a very good question, and the problem is that I am not the one who is like dealing with that, so I can only talk to you about my personal experience. And again, what Antonio was saying about like this really about the commercial opportunity and drawing what potentially, you know, like most of the people now that are not connected are in rural, remote areas. I mean, when you look at the figures, you know, like in Africa, like 25% of the population is not covered by any network. They are in rural areas. So what is the commercial opportunity for operators? So it comes about like showing them that there is value to invest in these areas. Comes to trust as well, of like what Lorraine was saying earlier, that obviously like you share data that's quite sensitive. So it's really about like we aggregate all the data we have, and it's a lot of like building this trust relationship with the operators, so that they're willing to share it with us, because it's So, but then like on the micro level, I wouldn't be able to tell you in detail like how, you know, what's happening. But there's definitely also like a role for government like that to play, and that they're talking with operators of the importance of doing that to like for a social benefit as well. But yeah.
So that's, I think, a perfect segue. I think someone had mentioned before about the role of the government. How do you work with governments to, what kinds of challenges do you need to do to get them to provide data? Or as someone said, you talked about standard to change the data they collect, or how do you work with them to get them to feed the information that they have? And you've acknowledged as a critical component of the information that decision makers need. How do we work with governments to get them to support providing data? I know in my experience working with governments, they're always worried about privacy concerns, data protection concerns. And it's a tough one because we don't actually need individual level data. We need much higher levels of aggregation. Are there ways that we can work with governments to make it easier to get to yes, or to change their the systematic way they're going about things to try to improve decision making that you need to make to help us connect more with the world?
Maybe I can jump in that because I think it's exactly the point that I wanted to make in the previous session as well, in terms of how can we get the government to help the private sector with data that they have as well. And I think there are interesting examples around the world where data has been responsible for reducing the cost of deployment for the private sector. So I'll give you an example from Mexico as well. They have a pilot project, which it works pretty much like Airbnb of rooftops. So what they did was that they were able to compile an inventory of rooftops of government buildings, so that operators could actually deploy antennas. And we know the bottleneck that it is antenna deployment around the entire region of Latin America and the Caribbean and many other countries. In Brazil, it's a very big challenge as well. So, but at the same time, a lot of governments don't even have an inventory of all the official buildings that they have. So, I mean, it goes again to the problem of capability that we were talking in the previous question, and also about what was commented in the chat about the cost of doing that. And sometimes, I mean, we have a lot of possible applications of AI in neural networks and satellite images and all of that, in terms of trying to understand where the unconnected are, trying to make sure that you have models that improve and optimize transport networks that are also big costs for deployment. But at the end of the day, a lot of this bottleneck, especially in developing countries, comes in terms of Excel sheets. And the fact that you simply don't have lists of those of what is an inventory of a government. And when we go further than that, we can also think about not only interoperability of data sets, but also interoperability of regulatory frameworks and incentives. And I mean, in the literature of connecting the unconnected, one of the good practices is fostering dig once initiatives, in terms of when you deploy one particular infrastructure, you deploy a connectivity infrastructure as well, and fiber, and digging is one of the big costs for that. So I mean, if you're actually able to facilitate to the private sector in terms of accessing data that is available around public infrastructure, or the infrastructure that's already there, but the ones that are planned for the future, you're actually creating these incentives in terms of sharing more information and knowledge among the different stakeholders. But your question was on how do we make sure that governments do that? And I think it's about, again, improving the institutional framework and regulatory frameworks around the world, which sometimes are still stuck into legacy patterns, and they haven't really moved into being more streamlined and more simplified. And sometimes it's just a patchwork of very old and legacy legislation, but at the same time making sure that this is a priority in terms of doing evidence-based policy making, not only to facilitate to the private sector to do their job and to invest, but also to improve accountability processes from other parts of the society and economy.
Antonio or Anne, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think that whenever that we have been requested information to the governments, we realize that they are always, as you said, requesting some sort of NDAs, non-disclosure agreement. In such a way, they somehow feel protected about the misuse of that information. I have to admit, though, that in the case of the IDB, since those governments at the end of the day, they are part of us, they are shareholders of the bank, and we already have, let's say, by definition, NDAs with all of them, since they are having participations from the shares of the bank. So it makes sometimes that information request easier. But I mean, the incentives at the end of the day, and this is very much related to the DNA of our bank and our interventions. We are not working or we are not intervening in a particular country just because we want. We are intervening because there is a demand, there is a request from those countries. And they already understand that in order for us to design those projects and in order for us to support them throughout the implementation and execution, they will have to provide some information and some data. So I can tell you that I have observed a change in the pattern in the last 10 months with respect to the previous time, let's say to the pre-COVID time. These days, the countries that are approaching us, they understand that if they really want to have a sound project, well-designed, and with specific indicators that eventually can be tracked throughout the lifetime of the project, they need to provide data and they have to provide information. And in this regard, I mean, in all the conversations that I have had so far with the different governments in the region, in Latin America, I can tell you that they are very keen on providing that data. And I haven't seen so many cases in which they are requesting this non-disclosure agreement.
And just to be clear, you think that the willingness to provide data has gone up as a result of COVID?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think so. And not only that, Christopher, but even the interest from the government on having that data has increased quite a lot, because of precisely the situation that we are facing and designing policies to mitigate the impact, to design policies to coordinate different bodies within the government across precisely these emergency situations that we are facing. But moreover, to define policies to overcome the economy and to overcome the situation and make the economy be prepared for the post-pandemic situation. Most of the governments that we have been talking to, they are already gathering quite a lot of information and they are very keen on working on data analytics.
And so picking up on something in the chat, they're saying that about how do you obtain the ministerial support? It's what you're talking about is aligning incentives, Antonio, about they're getting something in terms of support for a project and something they want to do and to try to make it an addition. Now, Anne, you were going to say something as well.
No, I'm actually reflecting on what Antonio just said on the willingness to provide data that has increased, and I'm actually reflecting on so what because we talked about cost earlier and the quality. So does that mean government have the data? So are they more willing to put cost towards that now, because of situations? So just a few questions that are bouncing back to my. But on a more practical level, I'd say one example of several examples of work I've been doing in terms of really practical, how do we involve governments to collect data, is really to engage several stakeholders around the table and really have each of them having a responsibility and not having the responsibility for gathering data coming to the same stakeholder all the time, and really having this sharing responsibility, sharing cost, sharing who's gathering what sort of data, and in what time frame. And again, it comes back also to what is the data that need to be collected, and making sure that making it as cheap in a way as possible. And I think that recently, last year when I was in Benin, and we had a roundtable with different stakeholders to understand the digital gender gap, and it turned out that Benin was like, well, we don't have the information. First thing we need to do is actually measure it. And operators are interested in getting that sort of data. Governments are interested. I mean, different so the statistical office and the ICT minister, etc. So, and everybody like really cooperated to like, we need to get a plan and really have a plan in place to be able to collect this data. And it's a collective effort. It's not coming only from one. So, yeah.
So what's fascinating to me about some of the things you're saying is, what are we collecting the right data? And there's a question in the chat saying, it's not just about, connectivity, it's about the quality of the connectivity. And there's one world in which, there's a fascination also, we know now with download speeds. First, download speeds matter less than throughput because it's total actually delivered bits, but we're now understanding there's latency and jitter and all these other questions, reliability. But what strikes me, and so there's a natural debate that happens all the time, is are we collecting the right things? What strikes me a lot about the information you're talking about, the data you're needing, is not even about providing the actual delivered service. There's a lot of data you need to provide service in areas that don't have service. You're talking about, for example, Airbnb for government locations of buildings, mapping of location of buildings, or mapping of current existing needs, or for example, demographic characteristics, costs, things that affect costs. So I guess the question is what is the data that we're not getting that we need the most, that is the hardest to come by, that influences your decision making? I'd be curious, what is it, where is the gap, is in essence, in terms of the data we're collecting?
Yeah, there's even a very interesting question, like the last one that was posted about, power line and availability of electricity. I totally agree with this comment. Let me give you an example of how we are handling the design of a project from the development bank approach. And I guess that is pretty much similar in the case of other multilateral development banks. So first thing that we do is to precisely, by means of using georeferencing, GIS, we are trying to collect information about where the infrastructure is. Infrastructure means telecom infrastructure, electricity infrastructure, sewers as well, and whatever roads, whatever railways, whatever infrastructure that could be eventually the vehicle by which we can, provide internet services and internet access. So let's say first challenge is to have an inventory of that infrastructure. I totally agree that sometimes there are governments that they don't even have that information. And here we go to the point raised by Lorraine, in the sense that either they don't have it because they don't have the mandate, or even if they have the mandate, they don't have the capabilities to make that request strong enough that the telecom operators, or in general, whatever company of infrastructure is capable of that, or giving that information. So in here, we have another important issue to keep in mind. So if we are intending to use infrastructure, for instance, for the electricity to provide internet services, there is another piece of the equation that we haven't talked so far, which is the regulation associated to that particular sector, which is different to the ICT and telecom sector. And this could be even a major issue, because sometimes it could be situations in which the countries and the electricity companies decide simply not to provide those services, because as far as they start doing those services, they will have to comply with particular regulations that at this moment in time, I mean, if you just put in a balance the cost benefit, it makes no sense for them from a financial standpoint. So there's a whole bunch of discussion in this first step that, as I said, it begins with an inventory of that infrastructure. That is a major issue. Second phase is precisely, as you were mentioning, where the location of the different institutions that you intend to connect, institutions or municipalities that you want to connect. And here there is a number of information that we request in terms of the quality of services that you mentioned. So what is the bandwidth that they do have? or moreover, which is the bandwidth that they may require according to the area and population that they are intending to be served. So because this may have an impact in terms of the technical solutions that eventually could be put at the disposal of that particular location. So we need to somehow come up with a demand analysis that make us understand how much usage that infrastructure is going to have, and according to that, be able to go and move to the step 3 and identify which are the technical specifications. Those technical specifications are very much related to SLAs, a service level of agreement. It will be even issues related to affordability as well. That is another major issue that we have to think of. Or it could be particular aspects associated to estimating what are the technical solutions that makes or make no sense according to the demand that we are going to, or the populations that we are going to achieve. So that would be like the third step. And those are basically the 3 areas in which we are all the time facing the design of a particular project. And in some occasions, we are capable of getting that information. In some others, we are not capable of getting those informations in a 100% basics. And we have to have conversations on how to find alternative variables that somehow allow us to make a proper design of the project.
That's extremely helpful. I think that's a very useful way to frame things. Lorraine.
Yes, no, I want to add to Antonio's point there in terms of what data we are missing. And just to give you an idea, I worked with a lot with OECD countries, but also non-OECD countries. And one of the studies that we did in 2018 was about bridging the rural digital divide. And we carried out an assessment to understand what were the targets of connectivity across all OECD countries in terms of bridging the divide. And in the EU is pretty standardized, and they usually have the 25 megabits per second or 50 megabits per second for X% of the population, for example. But the problem is that a lot of countries that are non-EU simply having their targets fast broadband or ultra fast broadband or super fast broadband. And so there's a prefix to broadband there, which is not really standardized among countries. And it's interesting because by not even having that stated within their national broadband plans or strategies, there's no incentive to measure it. So I mean, the concept of broadband, it's still that one that was understood and coined by the ITU many years ago on 256 megabytes per second. Is that the kind of broadband that we're talking about when we're talking about connecting everyone? In most countries, it's not a satisfactory speed. And then you said correctly, which is, it's not only about speeds, it's also about all the other measures in terms of quality. And it's not only about the quality in terms of the momentary quality, but it's also the robustness of this network. And it's about the different user profiles of this network. Households have different needs than public offices, than businesses, than small and medium, big enterprises. So you have different profiles of needs as well. So we just need a better, more granular understanding of what we mean by connectivity there. And that is data that not even OECD countries are often collecting for their own regions. And it's not only about what percentage of the country is connected, what percentage is not, or it's also trying to understand and geolocate those different speed levels or quality levels of the internet. And that, I gotta say, it's not there yet, even in most developed countries. So when you look into developing countries, it's just you're just many steps behind, and that's very hard in terms of targeting public policy for specific regions to try to understand where the gaps are. And we mentioned issues around basic connectivity maps around internet. In the chat it was mentioned the issue of just electricity provision as well. I mean, there's so much knowledge which is not there that is needed for you to actually do good public policy and planning.
So it's fascinating. One of the things that we saw in a previous panel we organized, there was a person who was deploying, and I think in Uganda, and they wanted to look for anchor institutions. They wanted a diagnosis of schools, and there was no comprehensive list of schools that the country was able to provide. Interestingly, one of the initiatives I'm working on is the GIGA initiative that's seeking to connect every school. They're using satellite maps and actually are improving data and finding, able to create lists. And so there seems to be some opportunities in terms of using advanced tools to try to get some greater data out of this. A question in the chat about electric power. It is a critical issue. Sometimes the solution is to connect people more. There are essentially off-grid solutions, whether it's diesel power generators or solar generators or many different ways. And it's a huge problem that may not be solved in one particular way. So we only have a few minutes left before we switch to question and answers. And if someone has in the audience a specific question, I encourage you to put it in the Q&A section instead of the chat in phrase in a question. And if not, I will start asking questions I will continue the discussion. But the last thing I want to talk about is granularity of the data. So one of the things I know, for example, Anne, your work with Connected Women, sometimes we just have data on total usage, but we're missing important cuts. You mentioned earlier in your comments about gender. There are other communities in terms of urban-rural cuts, disability access, senior access, vulnerable youth. I'd love to hear more of your thoughts about how we're doing on getting the data we need, not just in terms of its amount and the dimensions, but the granularity to get at the policy issues that we all know are important.
Well, so in Connected Women, we're definitely really interested in gender, but as you say, like getting to, what is the percentage of women in rural areas who don't have access compared to men, youth, disabled, employed, non-employed. I mean, and what we're doing each year is we have a survey that we run across like 15 to 18 countries, and which is a national representative sample. So we have this kind of like cuts of the most, I'd say the most important for us in terms of like mobile for development in the GSMA, which are definitely around rural and right now for digital inclusion, looking at disabled people. What we don't have in terms of data, where it's a big gap now for us, it's around digital skills. And Lorraine talked about connectivity earlier, and that's on the supply side, but on the demand side, it's really understanding the granular, have a level of understanding of like what do people have the digital skills to operate internet, because we know that most of the people in low and middle income countries use internet on a mobile, and currently all the data that exist are very much either in developed countries rather than low and middle income, but also the skills, the ICT skills are usually based on methods to and indicators that are like computer based, so that are not relevant for low and middle income countries. And that's a massive gap we have, and where we're trying to do more on.
Lorraine.
Yes, I want to echo Anne's point and to say that we need more data and more evidence to understand the differences and how far we are behind in terms of including women in the digital economy. But it's also not only about including a column of binomial male versus female in some of these indicators, although that's also a gap. But that's certainly not enough to capture the spectrum of gender identities, but also while it's a problem in many countries, the lack of this binomial there, but it's also about representation. And I think it's about the questions that we are not asking in the surveys as input. I mean, what about how safe women feel in the cyberspace or an internet, in the entire ecosystem of the digital activities that they carry out? How productively they can use those tools, and if they have the skills and the capabilities to use those tools productively, but also how they use ICT tools to increase awareness on issues that are important for women. And at the same time, how sensors and the wearable devices are compiling data on their own bodies or on health or on reproductive health of women. So I think it's around inclusion in general and the questions that we are not asking. And at the same time, what are the architectures or standards and practices that we assume are working for everyone, but that at the same time excluding either women or trans people or senior or youth or people of color, people with disabilities. So I think the discussion is much broader than simply supply and simply connectivity and simply disaggregating to the level of male and female certain indicators.
Yeah, Christopher, if I may jump in here, I think that here there's definitely a challenge. I totally agree with Lorraine in the sense that, you know, we don't find, even if we want, and there is a particular component in almost every operation that is dedicated to gender, even if we try to include specificities related to the gender gap or even indigenous population, because it's also an issue related to diversity, we find some difficulties to find data and design the program itself. But you know, I think that the issue that Anne mentioned about digital skills, I cannot agree more. I think that one of the things that I have observed, and this is almost repeating in every country, is that sometimes they are designing programs on digital skills thinking about the average of the population. And I totally agree with her that first, this topic needs to be brought into the top of the discussion. It is not just about connectivity, it's also allowing the people and understanding people, the different users, either in terms of gender, in terms of diversity, or in terms of the business in which they are involved. This is a major issue. But the immediately after is how do we design those training courses on digital skills according to the maturity level. So in here, I would like to bring a very good example that is happening these days in Mexico. As you know, Mexico is a very large country with about 120 million people divided in 32 states. So one of the initiatives in which they are involved has to do very much with digital skills. But it is not just digital skills for the entire country, because as you may understand, there is a lot of differences between one area or another. There is a lot of differences between or across the different 32 states. And one of the things that they have done is to run socio-demographic and economic analysis that understands which is the level of maturity, digital maturity, that every state is facing, and what are the benefits that particular sectors or particular area of a population or strata, social strata, could benefit from the design of particular digital skills programs. So again, this is an example of how to use particular data to make decisions in this particular case on digital skills, which is another very important piece of the questions that we haven't brought at the very beginning, and I'm glad that Anne brought it now.
So I think it's a great point, because what's interesting is we spend most of the time talking about infrastructure, the supply side, providing service. digital skills, the comment by Afal Eleanor also talking about local content. You know, we know that there's other adoption drivers that are another key part of the equation, which were much less developed in terms of collecting data and standardizing. So there's two questions in the Q&A, and they're related, so I'm going to ask them at the same time. And they're talking about, Simon Ellis asked, what is the place of statistical standards in allowing data to be collected more cheaply and more comparably? And the second question is, from Susan Sanders, is can we encourage / work with countries to develop long-range strategic and implementation plans for implementing their SDGs and infrastructure? This would allow them to baseline, track, and report their progress and bring together all resources, including multilateral and NGOs, to work in unison to resolve issues in union and deliver them on time, in budget, and meeting prescribed specifications. So to me, the common thread about this is standardizing the way we approach data in ways that are globally, that are relevant. And there's a tension here, which is there are some variations across country where things won't always generalize. And there is a problem where a lot of the projects are specific to different things, but they're asking for a broad, in terms of effectiveness and cost reduction, can organizations like the positions, the ones you're in, advocate some generalized forms of data collection that will actually make it more useful, more effective? And is there a role to try to encourage or to model, to improve, to standardize, if you will, the way we collect data that would be beneficial here? Are we missing an opportunity?
I think I can jump on that one, and the answer to your question is yes, absolutely. I think there's a role to not only international organizations but also regional organizations to collaborate in working together to create those standards. And there, of course, there are challenges to doing it, especially when it comes to the sector. There's a lot of it which is already embedded in legal frameworks. So just to give you an example on the work that I was doing before in the OECD, we weren't able to find a consensus in terms of defining broadband because a lot of countries had already the definition of broadband within the legal frameworks, and that is a big challenge. But I do think that by iteration, and by including countries and the statistical offices and regulators and ministries in the discussion around evidence-based policy, and also by fostering this sharing of good practices in the methodological side in terms of compiling, collecting, and also comparing data, we actually build the awareness of the importance of doing that, and we move towards capacity building doing that, at least from the side of the government. But I think it's important to also stress how crucial it is to have different stakeholders around the table, helping with the process of understanding what the needs are and understanding what are the questions that are not included in the surveys in the statistical frameworks as well. So it's very important to include stakeholders around the table when we are negotiating these standards, statistical standards. But the standards are there for that reason, to exactly reduce the cost in terms of having one model or one methodology that other countries can apply to. So I think there's a lot more room in terms of interoperability between between the different statistical frameworks of international organizations and regional organizations alike.
Yeah, if I may, Christopher, I would like to bring here a real example. I think that the points raised by Lorraine, I mean, they're amazing in the sense that they are bringing precisely the different views. But let me put you an example that precisely I have the opportunity to work with her directly 3 years already ago or something like that, Lorraine, yeah, when we were drafting this toolkit on broadband policies for Latin America. You know, Lorraine was precisely in charge of leading this group within the OECD where the first starting point was precisely to understand what was going on across the region and the different countries. And she mentioned something at the very beginning that I believe that is very, very important. One of the problems that we have faced and that we are actually facing whenever that we are trying to make comparable indicators is precisely the level of heterogeneity. I mean, the information is very different. It is very heterogeneous. Let's put it this way. It varies very much between country and another country. So having the political will, having the institutional capabilities, as he was mentioning, and having the coordination across the different institutions that at the end of the day are going to be involved in information gathering, but more importantly in the analysis, will help us and will help them eventually to establish comparisons between one and another. So in addition to the points that she mentioned, I will add something that also was mentioned at the very beginning and is very much related to make the variables comparable, which is a tricky thing.
So Anne, do you have any thoughts on the roles that you can use for coordinating data and making it more effective?
No, I mean, I completely, again, echo like what Antonio just said, and that's something we see in our work all the time. It's every institution has a different way of measuring something. It's and it still don't have the solution on how can we make it better. And we're talking international institutions, ITU. I'm just thinking about like digital again and mobile, but we have Gallup data, ITU data, GSMA data, and we all have a different way of like collecting information on mobile, on gender, on internet access, and connectivity in general. And it's a lot of discussion and raising awareness around this that at some point will make it happen, and hopefully get to something that everybody will agree on. But it's a long road.
So I think that's something that it's an interesting idea. So I heard two things. Among other things that Lorraine was getting at is the collection of data can actually serve as an educative function in terms of capacity building as well. And it's interesting, I've seen this not just at the national level, but at the grant application level and when you're actually giving out money, by making people report certain kinds of information to supply, that's often their first indication that they need to be developing a plan for these different dimensions they have to report on the grant application. And it's possible that there's a way of collecting data is a way to signal to different authorities that getting this information is important. And it's something that can, because obviously one of the things that's interesting is until you have the data, you don't know where you are and you can't do anything. But as you know, just collecting data can actually change people's behavior. The fact that something becomes visible automatically increases its salience, and without even strict regulatory sticks to make people change their behavior, people can actually just start to change. And so it's a very interesting soft touch way to do this. And we had a question in the chat about starting with user needs at the rural level. I think this is absolutely consistent with what all of you are saying. Almost all the data collection efforts you're talking about begins at the rural level, and you have a plan for what you're going to get, but aggregates from the bottom up to make it all work, because otherwise it's never going to function properly. We are at our time. At this point, I would like to say thank you to our panelists for still leading a very stimulating discussion. It's a challenge that I'm sure that we will continue to have conversations about. I'd like to say that we solved all the problems about data gaps and data collections in this hour, 75 minutes, and we can now proceed and not to talk about this again further. I think that we all know that the problems will continue to evolve, and actually a sign of progress is to have new problems to work on, because it will always be a challenge to how to bring, to marshal the information we need to bring more of the benefits of the internet to more of the world. So on that, I'd like to thank Lorraine, Antonio, and for being part of, I think was a fantastic discussion. And we really appreciate all of you being here. And thanks to everyone in the audience for your questions and your participation. And we look forward to seeing you at future events and later events at this IGF and future IGFs as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, bye.
Hello, the streaming is ending, and thank you for your participation.